sort of intro on Margaret, and then I'll turn it over to you, David and Jill. But first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me and also for joining our sort of joint lecture. My name is Stephanie. I'm the Curator of Collections with the Molly Brown House Museum, which is owned by Historic Denver. And this is actually the first talk in our speaker series called Unsinkable on the Nile is tonight's talk. So this is going to be about Margaret Brown's trip to Egypt before she boarded the Titanic. And I want to give just a little bit of background information on Margaret for those of you who've never heard of her, other than maybe that she survived the Titanic. Well, first of all, she wasn't actually called Unsinkable until years after the Titanic disaster, and she was never called Molly until her obituary. But that is obviously the name that has lived on over the years after her death. And during her lifetime, she was always Mrs. J.J. Brown or Margaret. And it was just days after the disaster that they called her heroine of the Titanic for the work that she did caring for immigrant survivors and starting a relief fund right away. So Margaret had humble beginnings in Hannibal, Missouri, and then she married James Joseph Brown here in Leadville, Colorado. He was a mine manager who then struck a huge vein of gold in the Little Johnny mine and made them very wealthy. So it was at that point that they moved to Denver and began traveling the world and bringing back souvenirs from every country they visited, including Egypt. Flash forward a few years, when the Browns separated in 1909, Margaret basically just traveled even more at that point, and it was in 1912 that she took this trip across the Atlantic that would make her world famous, even still today. So I like to think, though, that it was what Margaret did after the Titanic disaster, when she jumped into action to care for these people who were suffering, and she started a fundraiser right away. And that's really what makes Margaret, in my opinion, and sort of all of our opinion here at the museum, truly remarkable and inspirational to us even today. So I will leave it at that, and I will now turn it over to Egypt historians David and Jill. They've done some extensive research on Margaret's trip to Egypt, or what might be her trip to Egypt, just before boarding the Titanic.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everyone. This lecture is titled Unsinkable on the Nile, Margaret Brown in Egypt. So tonight we'll follow her journey up the Nile. But first, a word about my sources and how I have an itinerary of Margaret's travels. There's conflicting information, and even the so-called experts can't agree on the facts. However, through extensive research, I put together the most likely timeline for her trip. To determine where she was, I've used newspaper articles, letters, books, information found online, and travel guides. On this calendar, green-colored days are activities verified through original sources. Yellow days are derived from sailing schedules, and pink days are just my educated guess as to what she did when she was in Alexandria, Cairo, Naples, and Rome. The story of Margaret's journey up the Nile began when she and her husband JJ separated in 1909, and Margaret began regular visits to Newport, Rhode Island. Newport was the summer retreat of America's rich and famous, and she met and befriended many wealthy people there, including millionaire John Jacob Astor IV. Colonel Astor, called Jack by his friends, was a New York real estate baron who built the Astoria Hotel. Educated at Harvard, in 1912 he was the world's richest man, worth $150 million, and that's $4.3 billion today. In September 1911, Astor married Madeleine Talmadge Force. Then in January 1912, the newly married couple set out for Egypt on their delayed honeymoon. They were accompanied by Astor's valet, named Victor Robbins, Madeleine's maid, Rosalie Bidois, their nurse, Carolyn Endress, and Kitty, Astor's Airedale Terrier. Margaret Brown had been invited to travel with them. So why go to Egypt? Well, winter in Egypt was certainly warmer than New York or Paris. And as part of the grand tour, visiting the land of the pharaohs was considered part of an aristocratic education. Much had already been published about Egypt. From the early writings of Herodotus to the amazing drawings of Egyptian monuments by Napoleon's savants, Egypt was a popular destination for well-off travelers. And at that time, magazine ads and travel posters were enticing globetrotters to visit Egypt. Those adventurous travelers were not just rugged males in pith helmets. Women journeyed up the Nile too. Both Florence Nightingale and Lucy Duff Gordon wrote about their travels in Egypt. And as we learned in the ESS talk last month, Maggie Benson and Nettie Gourlay were early excavators at the Temple of Mut in Luxor. Also, Amelia Edwards published a very popular travelogue about her 1872 trip 1,000 miles up the Nile. If you're interested in hearing more about Amelia's voyage, Jill and I have presented a lecture about her trip last year. It's recorded and available on the ESS YouTube channel. Let's begin Margaret's journey to Egypt. January 24th, 1912. The Royal Mail ship, RMS Olympic, is getting ready to sail from New York Harbor. Owned by the White Star Line, she was the sister ship of the Titanic. On Margaret's voyage, the Olympic was commanded by Captain Edward Smith, who just 2.5 months later would go down on the Titanic. The Olympic was a big ship with 2,435 passengers and 950 crew members. Among those on board were 44-year-old Margaret Tobin Brown, 47-year-old John Jacob Astor IV, and his 18-year-old bride, Madeleine. Of course, Margaret and the Astors traveled in first class, and the Olympic was known for its luxurious accommodations. This is her forward grand staircase. It's very similar to the one on the Titanic. Here's a color photo showing its wood paneling. The Olympic and Titanic also had an aft grand staircase. These staircases linked the lower entry deck all the way up 9 levels to the top lifeboat deck. However, most of the forward section of the top 5 decks was restricted to first-class passengers. This is the Olympic's first-class lounge and her first-class library. Here's the Olympic's first-class restaurant and her first-class bedrooms, done in Empire style. The fare charged in 1912 for a first-class parlor suite was 870 British pounds, the equivalent of about $100,000 in today's money, just for a 6-day voyage. Wow. I sailed around the world myself in the 1960s, but unfortunately my cabin did not look like those first-class suites on the Olympic. Then again, I didn't pay as much either, and at least I got the lower bunk. Now let's sail with Margaret on the Olympic to Cherbourg, France. After an uneventful crossing, the Olympic arrived in Cherbourg on January the 30th, 1912. Then Margaret and the Astors would have taken the train to Paris. In Paris, they joined up with Margaret's 22-year-old daughter, Catherine Ellen Brown, known as Helen. Helen was a student at the Sorbonne, studying to be an actress and playwright. It's possible that John Astor felt that Helen's inclusion on their trip to Egypt would provide Madeleine with someone near her own age and social standing. To get to Egypt from Paris, Margaret, Helen, and the Astors, let's just call them the Astor Party, would have taken the Blue Train to Nice. Agatha Christie featured the Blue Train in one of her novels, The Mystery of the Blue Train, and you may have seen the film adaptation starring David Suchet. But it's no mystery, however, why John Astor would have chosen this train, for it was one of the most luxurious trains in Europe. Called the Blue Train because of its blue passenger cars, and owned by the same company that operated the Orient Express, it was the way to get to the south of France to catch an ocean liner bound for Egypt. On February the 1st, 1912, it's a rainy night at the Paris' Gare de Lyon train station. At 20 minutes to midnight, a lonesome whistle sounds. Signaled the departure of the Blue Train, headed toward the south of France. The New York Times reported that the Astors were traveling across France in a special car, meaning John Astor would have reserved an entire train car, or maybe two, just for his party. The Astor party arrived in Nice on February the 2nd at 7 p.m. and stayed overnight. The next day, they departed for Egypt from Nice's deep-water port at Villefranche. Their ship was the Franconia, operated by the British Cunard Line. Built in 1910 for transatlantic travel, the Franconia had several millionaire suites, 174 first-class cabins, and held a total of 2,610 passengers. It was a big ship. It even had a fireplace in the first-class writing room. During the winter months, the Franconia, like many other transatlantic ships, plied the waters of the Mediterranean. This is the Franconia's formal first-class dining room, where lobster, caviar, and pâté de foie gras were served in abundance, accompanied with fine wines, of course. Remember, Edwardians still had the habit of dressing for dinner every evening. And this ship, like many others, had a veranda cafe with panels which could be opened in good weather to let in the fresh air and create a sidewalk cafe atmosphere. This is her first-class lounge. Just picture Margaret and the Astors meeting there to discuss the sights they will see in Egypt. Their voyage to Egypt took 6 days, stopping at Naples and Syracuse, Sicily. The Astor party arrived in Alexandria on February the 9th, 1912. And as they entered the harbor, they would have passed Fort Kite Bay, built out of the ruins of the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The lighthouse was destroyed by an earthquake in 956 CE. After days of travel by train and ship, they probably stayed a couple of nights in a posh hotel, like the Windsor Palace, and then took in the sights of Alexandria before heading on to Cairo. This hotel, built in 1906, was originally a residential palace owned by a man named Windsor. It was one of the most luxurious hotels in Alexandria. Just like today, most visitors arriving in Egypt hired a tourist guide, someone who speaks Arabic and their own language. In 1912, these guides were called dragomans, a Semitic word meaning interpreter. One of the most famous dragomans at that time was Hamad Hassab, who guided Henry Sleeper Harper during his visit to Egypt in February and March of 1912. After remarking that he wanted to see the country
that all the crazy Americans came from,
Harper took him back to New York on the Titanic. Hassab survived the sinking and proudly displayed this fact on his business card afterward. I could not find who the dragoman was for the Astor party, but you can be sure that one was engaged as soon as they arrived in Egypt, and the dragoman would have accompanied them up the Nile. In Alexandria, Margaret and the Astors probably would have first visited the Qom el-Shikafa catacombs, and then the column misnamed Pompey's Pillar, which was actually the base for a statue of a Roman emperor, Diocletian. Then it was off to Cairo by train. Before boarding a ship for their journey up the Nile, it's likely the Astor party stayed for a couple of days at one of the 2 opulent hotels in Cairo. There was a luxurious hotel at Giza called the Mina House, but most wealthy people stayed at the famous Shepherd's Hotel in downtown Cairo. Shepherd's was built in 1841 by Samuel Shepherd. The original hotel was, in its elegant heyday, the place to be seen when in Cairo. Shepherd's famous terrace, set with wicker chairs and tables, commanded a lofty and shaded view of the comings and goings on Ibrahim Pasha Street, where it is rumored ladies of the evening could be found. Here's a short video to show you what staying at the original Shepherd's was like.
The grand entrance hall was done out in Pharaonic style with thick lotus-topped columns, and at the bottom of the main staircase was a pair of life-size bronze statues of bare-breasted women in ancient Egyptian headdresses, holding up electric lamps. Off the hall, there was reading, drawing and music rooms carpeted with plush Persian rugs. There were 340 bedrooms and 240 bathrooms, which was remarkable for the time, given that in the second half of the 19th century, 2 bathrooms to a floor in any hotel in Egypt or otherwise was considered fairly generous.
Amelia Edwards said,
At Shepherd's, during the beginning of the tourist season, assembled daily some 200 or 300 persons of all ranks, nationalities, and pursuits, half of whom are going up the Nile. Here are invalids in search of health, artists in search of subjects, sportsmen keen upon crocodiles, collectors on the scent of papyri and mummies, and the usual surplus of idlers who travel for the mere love of travel.
unfortunately, the original Shepherd's burned down in 1952, and though it was rebuilt a mile away along the Nile, the new Shepherd's is nothing like its predecessor. In 1912, the first stop for visitors was, of course, the Egyptian Museum, built 10 years earlier. The museum was arranged in galleries by era, beginning with the Old Kingdom, working its way through history to the late period. In addition, there were themed galleries containing coffins and mummies, pottery, musical instruments, jewelry, etc. It was a great starting place to learn about the history of ancient Egypt. But just a brief word about the timeline of ancient Egyptian history. It's divided into 4 basic periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the Late Period. These dates, though, are a bit fuzzy, as the Egyptians dated their years from the start of each pharaoh's rule, and some of their reigns overlapped, and here and there, a king or two were left off the list, so these dates could easily be off by 100 years or so. These periods were further subdivided into dynastic families by a Greek historian named Manetho. However, this was something the Egyptians did not do. Instead, they saw each new king as simply following the previous ruler, whether or not they were actually related. Egyptian self-rule ended when Alexander the Great showed up in 332 BCE, but that's another story. The Astor party's first outing to see the pharaonic sites was probably a visit to the pyramids of Giza, constructed about 4,600 years ago. Amelia Edwards commented,
When at last the edge of the desert is reached, the long sandy slope climbed, and the great pyramid, in all its unexpected bulk and majesty, towers over one's head. The effect is as sudden as it is overwhelming. It shuts out the sky and the horizon. It shuts out all of the other pyramids. It shuts out everything except a sense of awe and wonder.
and by the way, Baedeker's guide recommends taking sun umbrellas and smoked spectacles when visiting the pyramids. The left picture shows Margaret and Helen on camels in front of the Sphinx, which was partly buried in the sand in 1912. One of the Astors may have taken this photo. The man on the donkey was probably their dragoman. I don't know if he accompanied them up the Nile or if Cook's Tours supplied a different dragoman for the Astor's Nile cruise. Speaking of the Sphinx,
We can only afford one monument. Compromise. On second thought, let's try it the other way round. My head on a lion's body.
haha. I don't know if anyone in the Astor party climbed the Great Pyramid, but it was a popular activity at that time. To climb it, Baedeker comments,
Assisted by 3 Bedouins, 2 holding each hand and a third pushing from behind, the traveler begins the ascent of the steps, each about 3 feet high. The strong and active attendants assist the traveler by pushing, pulling, and supporting him, and will scarcely allow a moment's rest until the top is reached. The ascent may be made in about 15 minutes, but it is recommended to take nearly double that time to avoid arriving breathless at the summit.
and then what did one find at the top? Perhaps people having tea and sunbathing? Or maybe Jim Loudermilk? But seriously, climbing a pyramid is difficult today as it's done without assistance. I've climbed one myself. It's pretty scary when you come back down the 51-degree slope from 400 feet up, and the only way back down are those giant 3 to 4 foot high, slippery, sand-covered steps. By the time of their visit, all 3 of the large pyramids on the Giza Plateau could be entered, but robbed in antiquity, there wasn't much to see inside. The 2 largest pyramids are enormous. The Great Pyramid of King Khufu, far right in this picture, is some 481 feet high and 756 feet long on each side. and it's made up of 2.3 million blocks, each the size and weight of a small car. And the middle pyramid of King Khafre is almost as big. Next to the Giza pyramids are hundreds of tombs. Tombs of the wealthy usually consisted of either a rock-cut tomb in the side of a cliff or a chamber under a stone building called in Arabic a mastaba. Both types had a chapel in which a priest or relative could leave offerings in front of a false door. The false door allowed the spirit of the deceased to come and go between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The actual burial was in a shaft below the chapel. The walls of these tombs were usually decorated with the name and titles of the deceased and scenes of daily life. Since none of the tombs were electrified in 1912, Baedeker suggested taking along candles or a miner's lamp when exploring pyramids and tombs. In 1912, most of the mastaba tombs in the Eastern Cemetery at Giza were covered in sand, but a rock-cut tomb, G7948, then called the Tomb of Numbers, was open to the public. This Old Kingdom tomb was built for Khafre Ankh, a cult priest of the pharaoh Khafre. He lived about 150 years after King Khafre died. Among Khafre Ankh's titles were Companion of the Great House and Inspector of Wab Priests. Included in his wife Nikahor's titles was Prophetess of Hathor, the goddess of love. Below their statue is a small figure of one of their daughters. The left scene from his tomb shows an elderly Khafre Ankh leaning on a crutch, accompanied by his dog, an Egyptian pharaoh hound. Behind him is his son, who will follow in his father's footsteps to become a priest in the cult of Khafre. The right picture, Khafre Ankh's Ka statue, stands in his false door. Ka statues were carved with the likeness of the deceased. They were a reserved body in case the dead person's mummy was destroyed, so that the deceased spirit could find a place to reside while visiting the world of the living. Khafre Ankh's burial was in a pit under his tomb. The only other tomb accessible at Giza during the Astor party's visit was called Campbell's Tomb. It's actually an above-ground mastaba containing rooms with wall scenes honoring the deceased. It was originally excavated by Lepsius around 1850, who found the 26th dynasty's tomb owner's name was Pa Kap We Hebre M. Akhet, so no wonder it was called Campbell's Tomb instead. In 1912, an admission ticket to all the tombs and temples in Egypt could be purchased at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo for £1 Egyptian and 20 piastres. That's about $6 US. During the Astor party's visit to Egypt, Harvard archaeologist George Reisner was excavating at the Western Cemetery at Giza, and it was off limits to visitors. At this time, Reisner was also escorting one of his patrons, Henry Clay Frick, on a Nile cruise. Frick was chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company and a financier of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was a patron of the arts and founded New York's Frick Museum, renowned for its collection of paintings. I mention this because some websites incorrectly claim that Frick and his friend, banker J. Horace Harding, were members of Astor's group touring Egypt. Not true, as there are photos of Frick and company in Egypt with Reisner about a week before the Astor's arrival, traveling up the Nile on the Cook's steamer, the Sudan. The Sudan was a side paddle steamer built in 1901. Its name was originally spelled S-O-U-D-A-N. The Sudan was remodeled and updated in 1921, and this 121-year-old ship is still in operation today. Its name is now spelled S-U-D-A-N. The Sudan is the same ship that Agatha Christie traveled on in 1933. Seen here with her husband, archaeologist Max Mallowan, it inspired her to write Death on the Nile, which takes place on board the fictitious SS Karnak. If it looks familiar, this ship was used in the 2004 film Death on the Nile, starring Sir David Suchet as Hercule Poirot. Here's a short video of modern-day cruising on the Sudan, but note that the video has the wrong date of the ship's construction.
It's the last of its kind, a legendary Belle Epoque-style cruiser on the River Nile. The steamship Sudan began its life nearly a century ago in a Clyde shipyard in Scotland, before weighing anchor along the Nile in 1921.
Everyone along the river knows and respects the SS Sudan. It's a historic and prestigious boat, unlike any other.
The SS Sudan used to run on coal. Now, diesel powers its piston engine. Against the current, it cruises at 7 or 8 kilometers an hour.
It's so different from our usual frantic, fast pace in the Western world. We have time here to watch life on the riverbanks. I love this slow and steady pace.
Looks like a fun ship. Back to our story. In choosing whether to take a sailboat or a steamship up the Nile, Amelia Edwards said,
It seemed to us that the old-fashioned wooden dahabeah, flat-bottomed, drawing little water, and easily pulled off when stuck, was the one vessel best constructed for the navigation of the Nile.
To reach the second cataract on a dahabeah sailboat is a return journey of about 4 months, which was probably deemed much too long by John Astor. Steam-powered dahabeahs were introduced around 1900, and they significantly reduced the time for a return journey to Aswan to only about 4 weeks. They only accommodated 4 to 8 passengers, however, and they were just too small for the Astor party. Larger steam-powered paddle ships were traveling up and down the Nile by the time of their visit, and Astor chartered an entire boat, the paddle steamer Kansu, for his party. The Kansu was 125 feet long, 18 feet wide, and had a 130 horsepower steam engine. She had room for 12 passengers. Here's a bit of trivia. The paddle steamer Memnon, sister ship of the Kansu, became the SS Karnak in the 1974 film Death on the Nile, starring Sir Peter Ustinov. And if you haven't seen enough of Agatha's ships, the SS Karnak is back again in theaters this year in the latest version of Death on the Nile, starring Sir Kenneth Branagh. So maybe that's all you have to do to get a knighthood? Just cruise up and down the Nile playing Hercule Poirot? Sorry. I'm also disappointed that Branagh's SS Karnak is only a movie set, built and entirely filmed in a studio parking lot in the UK. There's nothing sacred. But sorry, I digress again. Several websites and books claim that Margaret never got any further than Cairo and she had to rush home to connect with the Titanic because her son had taken ill. This does not make sense. She was in Paris, not Cairo, and only learned of her grandson's condition a day or so before the Titanic sailed from Cherbourg, long after she had left Egypt. And according to family letters, she had planned all along to return with the Astors on the Titanic. Also, it was her baby grandson's condition that concerned her, not her son's. So, did Margaret and Helen go up the Nile with the Astors? Their answer is probably, for the following reasons. First, the only monuments to see around Cairo at that time were the pyramids, the Sphinx and its temple, and 2 tombs. It's a very small list. Second, the Astor group were only 5 people. There was lots of room on the Kansu for Margaret and Helen. Third, Madeleine was 5 months pregnant at that time. She would probably have appreciated Helen's companionship. Fourth, Margaret afterwards made comments about visiting the huge monuments of Ramses the Great, and there are none around Cairo, an inscription from an obscure temple in Nubia, a statue of Ramses among the gods at Abu Simbel, and how inadequate she found her guidebook. It sure sounds like she saw all these sites in person. And last and most important of all, letters and calling cards left in her estate prove she was well connected with the Astors, and she told family members that she sailed up the Nile with them. So back to our story. Here's Cook's 1912 itinerary for a voyage up the Nile to the Second Cataract. Stopping places are shown in yellow. Here's a quote from the New York Herald, January 25th, 1912.
For the trip up the Nile as far as the Second Cataract, Colonel Astor has chartered the Kansu, one of the fastest dahabeahs on the river. Plans for the trip upriver are indefinite, as stops will be made at any point where Colonel and Mrs. Astor desire to go ashore. Several inland trips, including one to the pyramids, will be made.
Unfortunately, as far as I know, almost all trip notes, diaries, and photos of Margaret and the Astors' Egyptian adventure went down on the Titanic. Although I do know they were headed from Cairo to the Second Cataract, I don't know exactly where and when they stopped on their trip up and down river. Of course, they probably had the Cook's tourist guide and would have visited the highlighted places mentioned previously. And they might also have had other guidebooks like Baedeker's and the recommendation of their dragoman on which additional stops were worthwhile. Using both my Thomas Cook and Baedeker's tourist guides from that time, I determined what would have been accessible in 1912 at each stop for tonight's virtual voyage up the Nile. Margaret lamented using these guides in a letter posted the day she left Paris for the Titanic.
Ill-equipped, as are all travelers who go through Egypt with nothing more than guidebook knowledge, holding to the merest thread of an explanation, one wanders from place to place, lacking altogether that potent charm of forgotten association that no guidebook can furnish. Consequently, one has only a vague conception of the historical importance of things they see.
So there's the two guidebooks she could have had with her. In my 1910 Baedeker, however, I found there was a wealth of information available in this guidebook. Here's 3 pages showing the plan of a tomb at Saqqara, a diagram of the scenes on each wall, and explanations and drawings of the principal scenes. In fact, my 1910 Baedekers is much more thorough than their modern version. However, I do sympathize with Margaret. On my first trip to Egypt, I attempted to visit sites without a guide, using only a guidebook as my reference. It was very confusing, and I had trouble understanding what I saw, and the difference between the old, middle, and new kingdoms, let alone those confusing dynasties or even who was who on the king's list. I think a lot of first-time travelers have this same problem. So let's assume that Margaret and Helen joined the Astors on board the Khonsu for its voyage up the Nile. The first stop upriver from Cairo is Memphis. Cook's guidebook says Memphis is a half-hour donkey ride from the steamer dock. By 1912, there was little left of ancient Egypt's capital city. Over the centuries, its stone walls and buildings had been quarried away, and what was left of the city was buried under many feet of Nile flood debris. About all that was still visible were 2 great colossi of Ramses II, toppled and lying on the ground. Amelia Edwards commented,
"We are in the midst of palm woods, threading our way among the mounds. We gather around the brink of a muddy pool, in the midst of which lies a shapeless block of blackened and corroded limestone. This, it seems, is the famous prostrate colossus of Ramses the Great. Where is the temple? Where are the pylons, the obelisks, the avenues of sphinxes? Where, in short, is Memphis? One looks in vain for any sign which might indicate the outline of a boundary wall or the position of a great public building. Is this all that remains of Memphis, eldest of cities?"
Modern excavations have revealed the low walls and foundations of some of its buildings, but most of the city is gone. What was worth visiting nearby, however, was Saqqara, the immense cemetery for the city of Memphis. It's located on high desert ground, reached by another 20-minute ride on donkeys. The site contains thousands of burials from every period of pharaonic history. The most prominent feature is the Step Pyramid, built 4,700 years ago by the 3rd dynasty king Djoser. It was the very first pyramid ever built. It's over 200 feet high and almost 400 feet long on each side. In 1912, the Step Pyramid could be entered and explored by this tourist tunnel dug during the 26th dynasty, about 650 BCE. Djoser's burial chamber lies 108 feet below in the bedrock under the pyramid. In fact, there are 11 pyramids near Saqqara, many of which could be entered in 1912. One of the pyramids at Saqqara opened during their visit belonged to King Unas. Here's the pyramid's entry corridor, 47 feet long and sloped down at 22 degrees. It leads to Unas's burial chamber, which is covered in hieroglyphic writing. Although robbed in antiquity, his granite sarcophagus is still in place. The writing on the walls is the first use of the pyramid texts, magical spells to have to get to the afterlife. They later became the basis for the Book of the Dead. Inside this oval, called a cartouche, is Unas's name. The rabbit and the wavy line spell Wen, followed by an I and an S, Wenis. The king's name was almost always enclosed in one of these royal ovals, which we now call a cartouche. The Serapeum at Saqqara was also opened in 1912. Discovered by Mariette in 1850 and used for the burial of 67 sacred bulls, it proved to be an amazing find. The sarcophagi, called by Baedeker monster coffins, are really massive at 8 feet wide, 10 feet high, and 13 feet long. They weigh up to 110 tons each and are carved from a single block of granite. Dozens of chambers with huge sarcophagi line the central corridor. It would have been very impressive then, as it still is today. There were 4 tombs at Saqqara open to visitors at the time of the Astor party's visit. The most celebrated of all, according to Baedeker, belonged to T, a 5th dynasty official who held the title of overseer of the sun temples of pharaohs Sahusere, Nefer-Irkare, and Niuserre. This scene shows a man milking a cow. His tomb has well-preserved scenes of boating, both in large ocean-going ships and small papyrus boats. This particularly interesting one shows hippopotamus hunting. Both crocodiles and hippopotami were highly feared creatures. Thus, the crocodile god Sobek and the hippo goddess Taweret were worshipped. The best preserved tomb at Saqqara is that of Mereruka, vizier to the 6th dynasty king Teti, whose pyramid is opposite Mereruka's mastaba. Here you can see his Ka statue standing in his false door. A very interesting scene in his tomb shows Mereruka's tax collectors beating into submission those who don't pay their taxes. It does seem that some things never change, and today's tax day.
Hope you all paid yours.
Next door to Mereruka is the tomb of Kagemni, another of King Teti's viziers. Among the daily life scenes here are depictions of fishing. Many species of fish can be identified, including those found in the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. The final tomb opened in 1912 at Saqqara was the double mastaba of Ptah-hotep and his son. He was the vizier of the 5th dynasty king Djedkare-Isesi. The left picture shows Ptah-hotep and his son, Akhet-hotep. Akhet-hotep, seen as an adult in the right picture, also became a vizier under the next king, Unas, and I showed Unas's pyramid just a few slides ago. The next step up the Nile that Khonsu probably made was at Beni Hassan. These tombs belong to Middle Kingdom governors, and they're located on cliffs high above the Nile. Baedeker's guide says,
Donkeys with good saddles are waiting at the landing places of the steamers. 3 to 4 hours should be allowed to visit the rock-cut cliff tombs. These tombs rank among the most interesting monuments in all Egypt.
In the tomb of Khnum-hotep, governor of the Gazelle province under King Amenemhet II, are scenes, shown here, of foreign merchants bringing trade goods to Egypt. They're clad in colorful garments, accompanied by their wives, children, goats, and donkeys. A popular side trip in 1912 was a 3-hour return donkey ride to the Spios Artemidos. Cook's travel guide says,
On the way to the Spios, the ruins of the villages of Beni and Hassan are passed, the villages having been destroyed by order of Khedive Muhammad Ali, owing to the incorrigible rascality and thieving propensities of the inhabitants, who are not much better at the present day.
The grotto is actually a rock-cut temple dedicated to the lion goddess of war, Pakhet, whose name means she who scratches. Constructed by the female pharaoh Hatshepsut during her joint reign with Thutmose III, there is an inscription on the wall which claims that Hatshepsut rebuilt Egypt, repairing the damage done by the Hyksos invaders 100 years before. But scholars, however, dispute this claim. One historian I found suggested the Astor party probably next stopped at nearby Amarna, as it was well known in 1912 as the discovery site of the Amarna letters, a treasure trove of correspondence between vassal kings in the Levant and Pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten, also known as the heretic king, had a beautiful wife named Nefertiti. In fact, just a few months after the Astors' visit, the famous bust of Nefertiti, now in Berlin, was uncovered by a German team in their excavations at Amarna. Archaeologists who have recently found another unexcavated sculptor's workshop at Amarna, and they're planning to dig there in 2024. So who knows, maybe they will unearth another treasure like the bust of Nefertiti. Baedeker commented that tombs at Amarna have great importance in their portrayal of realistic art. In the rock-cut tombs of the nobles, just east of the city, paintings depict life in Akhenaten's ancient city of Akhetaten, which means the horizon of the Aten. The Aten was the solar disk with light rays emanating from the sun god Ra. This scene from the tomb of Ai was drawn by Lepsius in 1850. Ai would later become a vizier under King Tutankhamun, and then afterwards follow as pharaoh himself. Here, Akhenaten and Nefertiti throw gold collars to Ai and his wife Te from his window of appearance in the royal palace. Retainers and other nobles bow as they praise the king for his generosity. If you're interested in more information about Amarna, I've just written a book about Akhenaten's royal court, which will soon be available on Amazon. Flinders Petrie and Howard Carter excavated at Amarna in 1892. They discovered several painted floors in the Great Palace and erected a protective roof and walkway around them. These floors lasted for 20 years until broken in pieces by a local farmer just a couple of weeks before the Astor party would have visited. The farmer was furious with tourists for trampling his fields as they walked across to the palace ruins. The remaining pieces were later moved to the Cairo Museum, and here's a close-up of marsh plants and a duck, which were painted on the floor. The next stop upriver was the ancient city of Abydos, where a huge temple built by Seti I could be visited. Baedeker comments,
The ground plan differs from that of other Egyptian temples. Instead of one sanctuary, it has 7, dedicated to Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ptah, Harakte, Amun, and the deified King Seti. It has the finest Egyptian sculpture of any age.
the chapel dedicated to the god of the underworld, Osiris, King Seti, in the form of the deceased Osiris, is venerated by the gods Thoth and Horus. Behind Seti's temple was the Osirian, thought to be the birthplace of Osiris. One of the most important scenes in Seti's temple is this list of kings. It names the pharaohs who ruled before Seti, who's shown here with his young son Ramses II. This list, and a couple more from other sites, gave Egyptologists an understanding of the order of the kings, and it confirmed a list compiled by Manetho in 300 BCE. But we now know that several kings were left off this list for political reasons. Pharaohs like Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Hatshepsut were considered to be radicals or usurpers, not fit to be honored in Seti's temple. Baedeker mentioned the nearby temple of Ramses II was in a ruinous state in 1912 and was hardly worth a visit. Today, however, it's been rebuilt and conserved, and it's definitely worth a visit at Abydos. The next stop was probably the Temple of Dendera, dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love and joy. This temple was started during the Middle Kingdom, was later expanded by Ptolemaic and Roman rulers. Since it had its original roof and walls and was dark inside, Baedeker suggested taking candles or a lantern when visiting. Dendera has beautiful scenes on its walls and ceiling, like this one on the ceiling, showing a seated Osiris sailing through the night, accompanied by other gods. Its most famous scene, however, is its astronomical ceiling, depicting the zodiac in 52 BCE. The ceiling was removed in 1821 and installed in Paris, and a plaster cast replica was put in its place at Dendera. For many travelers, however, the highlight of their visit to Dendera is this image on the back wall of the temple. It shows Queen Cleopatra VII with Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar. During their cruise up the Nile, Astor's dog Kitty was lost. She'd wandered away when they went sightseeing. Madeleine Astor said,
Colonel Astor was distressed by the loss of his dog and spent a great deal of time looking for her. Even when he had given up the search and started back up the Nile, he employed scores of natives to find her, promising a handsome reward for her return. Nothing was heard of Kitty until our return trip, when on passing another dahabeah, he spied Kitty making herself at home on board. The boat stopped and Kitty found her master with joyous barks. She had gone on board the wrong dahabeah, chartered by other wealthy Americans who knew to whom the dog belonged and were looking for us to return her. After that, a closer watch was kept of Kitty, and on board the Titanic, she even slept in our room.
Sadly, both John and Kitty went down on the ship. Upriver from Dendera is the ancient city at Luxor, called Waset by the ancient Egyptians and 100-gated Thebes by the ancient Greeks. After days spent living on the Khonsu, Margaret and the Astors may have opted to stay in the Winter Palace, a famous hotel in Luxor on the banks of the Nile, built by Thomas Cook and Son in 1907. It had a royal suite fit for kings, and of course, John and Madeleine Astor. A short walk up the Corniche from the Winter Palace is Luxor Temple, begun by the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III and completed by Ramses II. By 1880, the temple was buried under some 50 feet of Nile flood debris. Clearance began in 1884, and it looked more like the right-hand picture in 1912. Luxor Temple's pylon, built by Ramses II, supported 4 enormous wooden flagpoles with pennants. And by the way, the temple's missing obelisk is now the one in Paris. So it originally looked a lot more like this. Margaret said of Ramses,
One must know something of the facts of the reign of Ramses the Great to be at all able to appreciate the facts of this historic reign. In the 3rd year of his reign, he is spoken of as being very terrible in battle, as the bull powerful against Ethiopia, the griffin furious against the Negro. 2 years later, he carried fire and sword into Canaan and took, among other strong places on the sea and shore, the fortress of Jerusalem. Of his gigantic structures, only certain colossal fragments have survived the ravages of time, and yet those fragments are the wonder of the world. Every temple, Every place represents a hecatomb of human lives. Slaves from Ethiopia, captives taken in war, and Hebrews who were forced to extract from the quarries huge blocks of stone, some of them so large and heavy it took months to get them down from the mountainside. Ramses' designs were as vast as his means appear limitless. A dozen cities of Ramses are supposed to lie under nameless mounds that follow each other in quick succession along the banks of the Nile in Middle and Lower Egypt.
She then goes on to relate the biblical tales of Joseph and Moses, supposedly delivering the Israelites from bondage during the reigns of Ramses and his follower Merneptah. The outer wall of Luxor Temple's first pylon was decorated by Ramses with depictions of the famous Battle of Kadesh, fought in the 5th year of his reign. The battle scenes are pretty hard to make out today, but here's a reconstruction that shows them much better. And by the way, this artist forgot to include the 2 obelisks that originally stood in front of the temple. The Battle of Kadesh is one of the best-known military campaigns in the ancient world, in part because Ramses proclaimed his victory on the walls of almost every monument he built. Records from his Hittite opponents, however, revealed that Ramses only fought to a stalemate. That might be the reason he signed history's first recorded peace treaty. The figure of Ramses in this scene is interesting. There are 2 bows, 2 arms holding the bows, and 2 arms drawing the bowstrings. Perhaps trying to show action, an artist's correction, or is someone standing beside Ramses in his chariot? It's a mystery. Entering Luxor Temple through the doorway into the first pylon, you arrive in the Ramses courtyard with its 74 giant papyrus bud columns. Between the columns are colossal statues of Ramses II. And some of these statues even have a tiny Queen Nefertari standing beside her husband. A short carriage ride 1.5 miles up the Corniche from Luxor Temple is the huge temple complex at Karnak. Today, it's very impressive with its reconstructed temple dedicated to the god Amun and the lesser temples dedicated to his wife, the goddess Mut, and their son, the god Khonsu. The temples of Karnak were built over a 2,000-year span and cover an area of over 750 acres, more than a square mile. In 1912, however, Karnak was pretty much a ruin with columns, obelisks, and blocks scattered everywhere, the result of earthquakes and quarrying over the millennia. It's been conserved and rebuilt over the past 100 years. Here's what it looks like today, as seen from the sacred lake. Though the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut across the river could be visited in 1912, it was pretty much a ruin. Rebuilt today, it's a very impressive monument. One of the mortuary temples on Luxor's west bank that was frequently visited in 1912 was the so-called Ramesseum, built by Ramses II. In front of the temple lies the broken statue of Ramses, immortalized in the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. In 1818, he wrote,
"2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
Ozymandias is actually a corruption of Ramses' throne name, Uzur-Ma'at-Re. Here's how the Ramesseum looks today. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings and several other West Bank sites could also be visited in 1912, but it's time to head further up the Nile. Continuing upriver from Luxor, ships pass through the locks of a barrage built in 1906 to control the annual flooding of the Nile. Just afterwards is the next stop at the Temple of Esna. Dedicated to the god Khnum, temple construction began in the reign of 18th dynasty King Thutmose III, but was not completed until Roman times, around 250 CE. Khnum was the god of the source of the Nile, who lived under Elephantine Island at Aswan. He was also the creator of men on his potter's wheel. Just like at Luxor, this temple was buried under many feet of Nile mud, deposited during the annual flood. Auguste Mariette dug out the centuries of debris in the 1860s. Here's how the temple looked when Margaret and Helen would have visited in 1912. When you visit the temple today, you descend 30 feet below the modern ground level. 47 miles upriver from Esna is the Temple of Horus at Edfu, one of the best preserved temples in Egypt. It was built during the Ptolemaic era and completed in 57 BCE under Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father. Cleared by Mariette in the 1860s, it too had been buried 39 feet deep under Nile mud. Edfu Temple is dedicated to Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. The entrance to the temple is flanked by two huge statues of Horus. There's a scene in the temple showing Horus slaying his uncle Seth, who has murdered Horus's father, Osiris. Here, Seth is taken on the form of a hippopotamus to try and escape detection. But Horus is not fooled, and he kills his uncle in revenge. Just before Aswan is the two-part temple of Kamambo, dedicated to both the crocodile god Sobek and Horus the Elder. Charles Dana Gibson, who created the Gibson Girl, drew his party having tea in Kamambo Temple in 1899. It was published in his book, Sketches in Egypt. I wonder if the Astor party also had a picnic lunch among these ruins. But 2 weeks after leaving Cairo, the steamer would have reached Aswan, the furthest south they could travel on the Nile, on the Kansu. Aswan was the border city where Egypt ended and Nubia began, and it was an important center during all of Egyptian history. Visitors here could see temples, tombs, and the obelisk quarry. Aswan had luxurious accommodations at the Cataract Hotel, built by Thomas Cook in 1899. Patronized by kings and moguls of industry, it would have been an ideal respite from the cramped quarters of living on the Kansu. You too can stay in this suite, called the Agatha Christie Suite, for only $8,000 US per night, but breakfast is included. Cataract Hotel is most famous as a place to take tea on the terrace overlooking the Nile. Jill and I did this on one of our trips to Egypt. It would have been much more enjoyable if the waiter had not been so snobby. Just south of the town of Aswan is the first cataract of the Nile. Till the low dam was built, small dahabeyas could be towed up through the rapids, but it was a very dangerous practice. The low dam, just above the first cataract, was begun in 1899 and completed in 1902, and it prevented ships from continuing further south into the Nubian part of the Nile River. It took 10 years to fill up the small lake behind the dam, half submerging the Temple of Philae just upstream. Here's a picture of the partly submerged temple. In 1971, to save the temple, a coffer dam was built around it, the water drained, and stone by stone the temple was dismantled and reassembled on higher ground on a nearby island. Cook's passengers visited the temple on their way back downstream. In 1912, the high dam at Aswan had not yet been built. The entire length of what is now Lake Nasser was a winding river valley filled with over 100 Nubian villages and these temples along its banks. To sail on the Nubian Nile, Cook placed a paddle wheel steamer on the upper Nile, above the low dam, for the journey to the second cataract. According to a handbook for Egypt and the Sudan, the Cook steamer for the upper Nile set sail from its port of Shalel, just above the low dam, every Wednesday and February. And that's exactly when the Astor party were set to leave Aswan for their journey up the Nubian Nile. Here's the steamship that sailed the upper Nile in 1912, the Prince Abbas. She had space for 44 passengers. Here's 8 of the temples that were visited on a Cook's tour of the Nubian Nile. Before the Aswan High Dam flooded the valley in the 1960s, with international help, 24 monuments were moved to higher ground. But unfortunately, at least 12 more monuments are now under the waters of Lake Nasser. These 4 Nubian temples were gifted by the Egyptian government and relocated to these 4 countries, in thanks for helping move many of the other Nubian monuments to higher ground. The end of the line for ships traveling up the Nile was at Wadi Halfa, now at the southern end of Lake Nasser. Here, camel caravans crossed the desert to Khartoum. The second cataract lies just upstream from Wadi Halfa, and like the first cataract, it has huge granite boulders blocking the river. Beyond this point, the river is impassable, even for small boats. After reaching Wadi Halfa, visitors headed back down the Nile to Aswan. During the return journey, the steamer stopped at both Abu Simbel and Philae, sites that were overlooked on their way upstream. The first stop on the return downriver was the huge rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel. They were constructed by Ramses II at Egypt's border with the Sudan. There's 2 temples here, the Great Temple and a smaller one dedicated to Ramses' chief wife, Nefertari. Completed in year 24 of Ramses' reign, that's about 1255 BCE, the Great Temple has 4 66-foot-high statues of Ramses guarding its entry. The interior chamber is 60 feet long and 55 feet wide, with 8 huge pillars supporting the ceiling, depicting Ramses as Osiris. And at the back of the main chamber, there's another room with 4 statues dedicated to the gods Amun, Ra-Harakti, Ptah, and Ramses himself deified. With the flooding of Lake Nasser in the 1960s, the temple at Abu Simbel also had to be moved. In a 4-year-long project, the temples were cut into blocks and then reassembled 200 feet higher on the cliffside. These blocks weighed between 20 and 30 tons each. Here's one of the giant heads being moved and placed in its new home. Over 12 million cubic feet of stone was moved during the temple's relocation. Here's the smaller temple dedicated to Nefertari, which was also relocated to higher ground. It may be smaller, but it is still huge. An overnight stop at Abu Simbel was offered by cooks at the time of a full moon each month, and the Astor party were there at just the right time. Amelia Edwards arrived there on her dahabeah during a full moon. She tells us,
"The great temple stood before us. Though it was night, the 4 colossi came out, ghost-like, vague and shadowy in the enchanted moonlight. Even as we watched them, they seemed to grow and be moving toward us out of the silvery distance."
I've been to the pyramids, Karnak, Luxor, and Philae temples during a full moon, and it does make the ruins magical places. The Upper Nile steamer completed its trip back to Aswan with a half-day stop at Philae Temple. The main temple was dedicated to the goddess Isis. It was originally built for the 30th dynasty pharaoh Nectanebo, but it was expanded by both Ptolemaic kings and Roman emperors. The worship of Isis spread throughout the Roman Empire, and Philae was a significant place of pilgrimage during that time. Now let's leave Philae behind and return to Aswan. There was a faster, less luxurious way to get from Aswan to Cairo by rail, but Baedeker comments,
"The trains run much more slowly than in Europe, and the dust, which penetrates the carriages even when the windows are closed, renders railway traveling in Egypt exceedingly unpleasant."
So hence the Astor party probably reboarded the Khonsu and returned down the Nile, perhaps stopping at sites they missed on their way upriver. On a Cook steamer tour, the return voyage from Aswan to Cairo took 5 days. Back in Cairo, both Baedekers and Cooks recommended the travelers' final days in Egypt be spent exploring Old Cairo, the Citadel, Cairo's historic mosques, and of course shopping at the bazaars. While it's tempting to head for the bazaars and shop as soon as one gets to Egypt, it's best to wait until homeward bound. Otherwise, everything has to be purchased. Everything purchased has to either be stored for later retrieval or carted up and down the Nile.
We speak from experience.
The most famous shopping place in Cairo is the souk at the Khan al-Khalili, founded in 969 CE. It was, and still is, a great place to buy Egyptian souvenirs, as well as higher-end goods like gold and silver jewelry. Amelia Edwards said,
"In Cairo, begin with a day in the native bazaars, neither buying nor sketching nor seeking information, but just taking in scene after scene. Every shop front, every street corner look as if they had been put there expressly to be painted."
Clues to what Margaret purchased in Egypt come from her insurance claim filed after the Titanic sank. She listed a crate of Egyptian souvenirs worth $500. Now, $500 was a lot of money in 1912. It's equivalent to approximately $15,000 in today's money. Now, that would buy a lot of souvenirs in Egypt. In a newspaper article, Margaret also said she had a crate which contained Carrara model reproductions of the Roman ruins in the Basilica of Florence. She added that she had 2 more crates of bronzes and other things. These 3 crates were all bound for the Denver Museum. Their total value was listed as $500. So 2 of the crates would have had a value of about $333. What did she have in her 2 crates of bronzes and other things? And where did she buy them? Let's assume those 2 crates contained Egyptian artifacts. To figure out what could be bought in 1912, I used sales data from the Hilton Price auction held at Sotheby's in 1911. For small lots, the average price paid was £2 or $10 per object. Since these items were probably purchased cheaper in Egypt, I estimated these objects could be bought in Egypt for half of what they sold for in England, that is $5 each. So Margaret's $333, or about $10,000 in today's money, spent on the 2 crates of Egyptian artifacts, could have purchased approximately 67 small objects. And using the size of Edwardian shipping crates, I confirmed they could hold these objects and their packing materials. So what kind of artifacts did she buy? Again, using Hilton Price data, she could have purchased about 3 times the number of objects shown on this slide. There would not have been enough money or shipping space, however, to purchase large items like mummies, coffins, or big statuary. These artifacts were mainly purchased by museums. Where could she have purchased real antiquities? Tourists walking through the ancient sites are often approached by vendors selling souvenirs. Reaching into their pocket, they sometimes pull out what they claim to be a genuine antica. When this happened to me, I said I was not allowed to take real antiques out of Egypt, and the vendor said,
"Okay, it's fake, but how much are you willing to pay?"
But where could Margaret have purchased real antiquities? Two prominent dealers in 1912 were Maurice Naumann, who had shops in both Luxor and downtown Cairo, and Ralph Blanchard, who had an antiquities shop right next to Shepherd's Hotel. Before June 1912, dealers could sell to tourists with little oversight. After the Antiquities Act of 1912 was passed in June, dealers had to list every item sold, and tourists had to have the items inspected and approved before they were given an export certificate. So any antiquities bought by Margaret in February or March could easily have been shipped home with little or no inspection. The Egyptian government simply relied on the dealers to police the antiquities trade, kind of like asking cats to guard the mice. The only object Margaret bought in Egypt that did not go down in the Titanic was a small ushabti that she had in her pocket when she boarded lifeboat number 6. It was her good luck talisman. Margaret later presented this silver cup and her lucky ushabti to the captain of the Carpathia, the ship that rescued her. So what is a ushabti? Ushabti in late Egyptian means answerer, and it refers to a spell in the Book of the Dead where magical servants are brought to life to work for the deceased. Ushabtis often came in a box, and the deceased could be buried with up to 365 of them, one for each day of the year. Worker ushabtis can be identified by their mummiform shape and the agricultural hoe and rake they carry in their hands. To keep all of these magical workers on task, they were supervised by overseer ushabtis, who carry symbols of power like the crook, the flail, and the jed pillar. From the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom, many ushabtis had spells written on them, like this one from chapter 472 of the Book of the Dead. In case your ancient Egyptian is a bit rusty, here's an English translation, and Jill will fill in the owner's name as Ra-Hotep.
"Oh, this ushabti of the Osiris Ra-Hotep is detailed for any work that is to be done yonder in the netherworld, or an unpleasant task is imposed upon him there. As a man at his duties, you shall say, 'Here I am.' If you are detailed at any time to serve there, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the riverbanks, to ferry sand between the east and the west, you shall say, 'Here I am.'"
Some of those are on here. Margaret ushabti is an agricultural worker holding the hoe and rake. Most late period ushabtis have either an abbreviated form of the ushabti spell or some other text placed in a T shape. Stephanie from the Molly Brown House recently took this picture of Margaret's ushabti, and this view shows that it says the good god Osiris. I ran this by an Egyptologist friend, and he suspects her ushabti is a fake tourist souvenir made to look old. That might explain why Margaret just considered it her lucky talisman, and after all, it did bring her luck as she survived the sinking of the Titanic. And if you want to see this ushabti, it's at the Molly Brown House right now. It's recorded that Margaret and Helen stopped in Naples and Rome on her way home. I consulted the sailing schedules from Alexandria to Naples, and the only ship I could find that fit their sailing dates was the RMS Cedric. The voyage from Alexandria to Naples would have taken 4 days. I assume while in Naples, Margaret and Helen would have visited both Pompeii and Herculaneum. In nearby Rome, they probably spent a couple of days seeing the sights of the city, and Margaret picked up that additional crate of Roman models for the Denver Museum. Then they caught a train back heading to Paris. When they reached Paris, Margaret and Helen stayed at the Ritz Hotel, and as its name implies, it was a ritzy place to stay. Then, on the afternoon of April the 10th, 1912, Margaret and her friends, the Astors, headed to Cherbourg to meet up with the Titanic. Helen chose not to return to America with her mother, but decided to stay in Paris to complete her studies at the Sorbonne. Just 5 days later, Margaret and Madeleine would be floating in lifeboats, and John Astor and 1,517 other passengers would be dead. And the rest of the story, as they say, is history. So ends Margaret's first trip to Egypt. She would return again in 1927, but that's another story. Thanks for watching.